In today's all-time best, we are up to the Pittsburgh Penguins. And the Penguins, it's quite the list when you get to their best. Now, Penguins are really an all-or-nothing franchise. They've been fantastic, and they've been terrible. And there have been points during the mid-2000s and mid-1980s where they've been terrible. Now, the interesting thing is that this gave me the idea of when I'm done this list, maybe I'll do an all-time worst list for every team, too. That might be a lot of fun to look through all-time worst lists, and I can make different periods and different times we can look at. All right, so when were things the worst for every franchise, and then so that might be kind of a fun playlist to put together. But with Pittsburgh, with their all-time best, you have to just look at number 66, number 87, number 68, right? Number 71. Like they do pretty darn well with guys who have high numbers. They do. It's an argument in favor of high numbers, Lou Lamoriello. So, points. Mario Lemieux, 1,723. Pretty good player. He had 690 goals, 1,033 assists, and keep in mind, he missed a lot of time with injuries and due to retirement. So, if Mario had been healthy his whole career, he would have had well over 2,000 points, probably clipped maybe 2,500, maybe more than that. And we'll never know, but he's still an all-time leader for this franchise, a franchise which has a lot of pretty good players. Now, penalty minutes leader, I was actually kind of surprised at two things. One, that it's Kevin Stevens, and two, that it's only 1,048 penalty minutes, which tells you that they haven't had a lot of long-time enforcers on this team, or at the very least, if they're tough, they don't draw a lot of penalty minutes. So, Kevin Stevens is the leader. Kevin Stevens, who I've got also on the list of honorable mentions for best player they've had. Honestly, he was my favorite player in the league at one point. Right up there with Cam Neely. And I've never seen anybody fall off as quickly as Kevin Stevens. I mean, there's at some point in time there'll be a list of guys that have fallen off, like a Jonathan Cheechoo type, but man, Stevens, it was just insane. He went from basically the best power forward in hockey to not being even close within a couple of years. Power play goals leader, Mario Lemieux, 236 in his career as a Penguin, and of course in his career overall, because Mario never played anywhere else. And so we get to who deserves an honorable mention as the greatest in the franchise's history. Paul Coffey has to be up there. Jaromir Jagr has to be up there. Ron Francis, yes. Sidney Crosby is not in this list yet. Does he end up getting 700 goals in his career? Probably not. So that Lemieux may hold those records for forever. Malkin, one of the greatest, right? Rick Kehoe. Before Mario Lemieux, there was Rick Kehoe, who was a fantastic Pittsburgh Penguin at the time. Of course, Stevens, as I mentioned, Sel Apps. Apps played 499 games for the Penguins, had 500 points over that period. Chris Letang and Mike Bullard. Bullard, the guy who tried the year that they were tanking for Lemieux and didn't get traded for it or demoted for it. So yeah, it's a good list. You can add a lot of other guys to the list. Once we get to their best team, yeah, there's a lot of names mentioned there as well. Now, goaltenders, Marc-Andre Fleury is the best goaltender they've ever had, 375 wins, 19,487 shots against as a Penguin, and 44 shutouts. Now, Matt Murray is the leader in all-time save percentage with a 914. So while we have the debate about Murray versus Jarry, the reality is, in terms of historically looking at the numbers, Murray's been pretty good. So outside of that, honestly, when you're looking at their greatest goaltenders, you can make the argument that Barrasso deserves to be in that conversation based on 91 and 92. And some playoff runs he had after that as well. Denny Herron, who was behind some pretty poor teams along the way, but he still played well. And Ken Reggett, I wanted to have on the board because it's easy to forget that Ken Reggett was kind of a really good goaltender for this team for a short, not really a short while. He was there for a while. And he was really good. So you had Barrasso and Reggett, and at times Reggett looked like the better of the two goaltenders. So, it really has been a workhorse situation with their net, and yet you could also mention Johan Hedberg in there, the nice run he went on during his call-up, and then there were some others in between that, there were some good ones, just not great. I don't necessarily put in the category as Fleury, Matt Murray, or Tom Barrasso. I would think those would be the three best goaltenders they've had. hey, we can debate on how long Murray's been in their organization as an NHL goaltender, but he does have the 2 cup rings. So when we get to the most points, 119 points for them in 92-93 was the year they didn't win the cup. So what's interesting is the years they won the cup, they had 88 points the first year, 87 points the second year. And then the year they don't win the cup, they had 119 points. Huge winning streaks, everything's going their way. But it felt like the ego got to them, and then the Islanders knocked them out in 93 and prevented them from being seen as an official dynasty with 3 straight cups. For me, when I'm picking their best team, it's the 91-92 cup winners. So the second year where they picked up Rick Tocchet that year. So Hall of Famers are in red. Mario Lemieux, Joe Mullen, Larry Murphy, Mark Recchi, Paul Coffey, Ron Francis, and Brian Trottier. In blue, notables or future Hall of Famers. Jaromir Jagr, who will be a Hall of Famer. It is noteworthy that Roberts is in that lineup as well. Rick Tocchet. So Tocchet's there. Yeah, it's Gordy Roberts was in the lineup. Rick Tocchet. Let's see, who else deserves to be mentioned out of here? Jan Hrdina was there. Gets into the whole playoff thing too. And of course, Barrasso and net. They had Wendell Young as their backup. Reagan had played some games that year. Frank Pietrangelo was on his way out by 92, by the time 92 rolls around. But of course, Pietrangelo in 91 wasn't a passenger for that run. Yeah, it was a pretty good franchise. It was really, really well put together. And I'm going to cheat a little bit and do something I don't normally do when I go through these. I'm going to go over to GM. Craig Patrick put this together. Craig Patrick, best GM they've had. I don't think there's a huge debate. The coach, we'll get to the coach. There's some debate when it comes to the coach, and I can understand the argument for any of the 3. But Craig Patrick, to me, the best GM. He was just working magic. He did it at the 91 deadline, and he did it again in 92 when they picked up Tocchet. So, most wins against any one franchise, 127 against the New York Rangers. So, yeah, Pittsburgh Penguins play the Rangers a lot, same division a lot of that time. Their points percentage is best against the Winnipeg Jets, who were the Atlanta Thrashers, 777 all-time winning percentage against the Jets/Thrashers. Goals for against the New York Rangers, they have 948. So they're 52 away from 1,000. Speaking of 1,000, one thing that's interesting with the Penguins, they don't have a single player that's played 1,000 games for their team. Sidney Crosby's the leader, and he hasn't reached 1,000 games yet. So that's an interesting little fact as well about this team, that they're one of the few that don't have a 1,000 game player. Goals for per game against Vancouver, they averaged 3.93 goals per game against Vancouver. Not a big surprise. The number of times Vancouver's coming up, it tells me that I'm right. The Vancouver, traditionally, their defense, their goaltending, goals against per game, Winnipeg/Atlanta shows up there as well, 2.63. So, pretty good numbers against the Winnipeg Jets/Atlanta Thrashers. 777 winning points percentage and 2.63 goals against per game. They do pretty well there. Notable captains: Crosby, Lemieux, Jagr, Francis, Carlisle. Randy Carlisle's on the board there. Ron Schock in the mid-70s when they were wearing their nice blue jerseys. And Ab McDonald. Ab McDonald was their first ever captain. He was just there the 1 year, and he was their captain in their expansion year. So when we look at their playoff appearances, their consecutive run, the longest is 13 seasons, 2007 to 2019. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with 2020. But if we don't play 2020, they still have an active playoff appearance of 13 in a row. So then it would just become 14 next year. This year becomes just not a thing. It doesn't count as a playoff appearance because we didn't play the playoffs, right? Now, all of that aside, if we look at their coaching, is Scotty Bowman the best coach? Now, that's my vote. My vote is Scotty Bowman. He came in after Badger Bob Johnson passed away, and he was great. He was great at getting that team to a second straight Stanley Cup. But if you want to argue Badger Bob Johnson for taking him to that first Stanley Cup, I can't argue against that either. And then for modern fans that say, hey, well, what about what Mike Sullivan's done? Yeah, I can understand that vote too. Mike Sullivan, the back-to-back Stanley Cups. So there you go. And of course, you could make arguments for other coaches. But personally, my vote goes to Scotty Bowman. I think what he did, that first year he's there and getting them to that second straight Stanley Cup was incredible. It really, really was. And I thought that 91-92 team was put together extremely well by Craig Patrick. And in my eyes, the 92 run was more impressive than the one in 91. And it is kind of a shame that in 93, they took the Islanders lightly and then found themselves sitting at home when they very well could have won a third straight Stanley Cup in 1993. Now, the He Was a Penguin category. It gets interesting, and there were some names I could have put up here that I tried not to put up the same names over and over again for guys who bounce around a bit towards the end of their career. There may be some multiples up here, but I tried to keep that to a minimum. Anyways, on the list of He Was a Penguin, we have Peter Klima. Klima was a Penguin, briefly, but he was there. Brendan Morrow, known more as having played for Dallas, of course. Jerome McGinley, we remember him as a Penguin. It's still weird. It didn't last extremely long. Of course, he goes there from Calgary, goes through the playoffs. Boston gets rid of him in the playoffs, then he signs in Boston. Marian Hossa was a Penguin, of course, famously part of a Penguins team that lost, and then he goes to Detroit, and then they lost, and of course that's a whole thing for Hossa before he goes to Chicago and finally wins it. Alexander Daig, he's shown up on the boards a couple times. He was a Penguin. Another number 1 overall pick that's played for Pittsburgh. Ziggy Palffy, easy to kind of forget that he was a member of the Penguins as well. He wasn't there for that long. Tim Horton played for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He really did. Ron Duguay, easy to forget Ron Duguay playing there. Remember him more as a Ranger and then as a King after that. Charlie Simmer finished things out as a Penguin. Luc Robitaille was a Penguin, and of course in the playoffs. If you're watching the playoffs back then, you're like, oh, I remember Robitaille. Right, Robitaille scored some key goals that time around, but he wouldn't last very long as a Penguin. Miroslav Shaitan was a Penguin, and that was one that I had forgotten, so I thought, yeah, I'll write him on the board. Pete Mahovlich was also a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Not an extremely long period. That's why he ends up on the He Was a Pen list. And John LeClair, who is known more for being on the Montreal Canadiens in 93 and then for being a pretty darn good member of the Philadelphia Flyers and being part of that Legion of Doom run at the late 90s. But yeah, he did play for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and it's notable and it's on the board. So in terms of the all-time greatest, I would still say Mario Lemieux's the all-time greatest Penguin, but Sidney Crosby, Mario Lemieux, that comparison is going to be out there for a long time. And we'll see what happens when Crosby and Malkin are done and they have to replace them with some other big star name. Who do you replace Crosby with? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And again, this is the all-time greatest of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I will talk to you again soon.